What's going on, everyone? Today we uncover the disturbing truth behind one of psychology's most shameful experiments. A study so unethical, it became known as the monster study. The incredible story of how vulnerable children became unwitting test subjects in the name of science, and how this dark chapter changed research ethics forever. You won't believe what actually happened when respected academics decided that scientific curiosity was more important than protecting innocent children. So, before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, grab something to drink, and let's experience this incredible story together. Picture this. It's January 1939, and the University of Iowa campus is blanketed in snow. Inside the East Hall Psychology Building, steam radiates from the old radiators as graduate student Mary Tudor sits nervously across from her thesis advisor, Dr. Wendell Johnson. The office smells of pipe tobacco and old books, and Johnson's own struggle with stuttering is evident as he speaks in measured, careful tones about the research project that would define Tudor's academic career and destroy the lives of innocent children. Johnson, a man in his 30s with thick glasses and a reputation for brilliance, has spent years developing what he calls the diagnosogenic theory of stuttering. He believes with the fervor of a true believer that stuttering isn't something you're born with, but rather something that develops when children become overly self-conscious about their speech. In his mind, parents and teachers who constantly correct a child's normal speech disfluencies actually create the very problem they're trying to prevent. But here's where things get really interesting and deeply troubling. To prove his theory, Johnson needs something that would be impossible to obtain today: complete control over children's environment and the ability to deliberately harm them in the name of science. He needs subjects who can be observed, manipulated, and influenced over extended periods without parental interference or outside oversight. And he knows exactly where to find them. Just 12 miles east of Iowa City sits the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home in Davenport, the imposing brick building that houses nearly 600 children who have nowhere else to go. These aren't children from loving families who might ask questions or raise concerns. These are kids who have already been abandoned by society, wards of the state who depend entirely on the adults around them for care and protection. The orphanage itself tells a story of institutionalized neglect. Built in the 1860s for Civil War orphans, by 1939 it had become a dumping ground for unwanted children. The dormitories were overcrowded, the staff overworked, and the children desperate for any adult attention, even if it came from university researchers who saw them as convenient test subjects rather than human beings deserving of protection. Johnson approaches the orphanage administrators with a proposal that sounds benevolent on the surface. He wants to provide speech therapy services to the children, he explains, as part of a research project that could help stuttering children everywhere. The administrators, stretched thin and grateful for any outside help, readily agree. They have no idea what Johnson and Tudor are really planning. What happens next would violate every ethical standard we hold dear today, but in 1939, there are no institutional review boards, no informed consent requirements, no protection for vulnerable populations. Johnson and Tudor have complete freedom to treat these children however they see fit, and they're about to conduct an experiment that would be considered torture by today's standards. Mary Tudor, an earnest young woman who wants to make her mark in the field of speech pathology, begins the selection process. She walks through the orphanage dormitories, observing children at play, during meals, and in their daily routines. She's looking for specific characteristics: children who speak normally, children who show signs of stuttering, and children who seem particularly sensitive to adult approval or criticism. The selection process itself is chilling when you understand what's coming next. Tudor isn't just choosing research subjects, she's selecting victims. She evaluates each child's psychological makeup, looking for those who might be most susceptible to the psychological manipulation she's about to inflict. She pays particular attention to children who seem eager to please adults, who respond strongly to criticism, or who already show signs of anxiety or insecurity. After careful observation, Tudor selects 22 children ranging in age from 5 to 15 years old. She divides them into 4 groups. But here's the twist that makes this story so chilling and reveals the true nature of what they're planning. This isn't just an observational study. It's a deliberate attempt to psychologically damage children to prove a scientific point. Group 1 consists of children who stutter and will receive positive speech therapy, being praised for their fluent speech and encouraged to continue speaking freely. Group 2 contains children who stutter but will receive negative treatment, being criticized for their speech problems and made to feel ashamed of their difficulties. Group 3 includes children who speak normally but will receive positive reinforcement, being praised for their excellent speech. And Group 4, the group that would suffer the most, consists of children who speak normally but will be subjected to relentless criticism and psychological manipulation designed to make them develop stuttering. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to step into the shoes of these children and imagine the psychological horror they were about to experience. These aren't adults who can understand research methods or give informed consent. These are vulnerable children in an institutional setting, completely dependent on adults for their physical and emotional well-being. Picture 10-year-old Clarence Pfeiffer, a boy who had never had any speech problems, sitting in a small room with Mary Tudor for what he's been told is speech therapy. Tudor, following Johnson's explicit instructions, begins to tell Clarence that his speech is problematic. She explains that he's beginning to stutter and needs to be extremely careful about every word he says. She warns him that if he doesn't monitor his speech constantly, his problem will get worse and worse until no one will want to talk to him. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. Clarence, who had been chattering freely just moments before, suddenly becomes afraid to speak. He begins to hesitate before every word, analyzing each syllable for potential problems. The natural flow of his speech becomes labored and self-conscious as he tries to follow Tudor's instructions to monitor every sound he makes. But Tudor isn't finished. Following Johnson's protocol, she continues to point out Clarence's normal speech disfluencies, the tiny hesitations and repetitions that are part of every child's natural speech development. She tells him these are signs of serious stuttering and that he needs to work harder to control them. She makes him repeat words over and over, correcting him when his speech isn't perfect, creating a cycle of anxiety and self-consciousness that transforms normal speech into a source of terror. The same scene plays out with other children in the negative treatment group. 12-year-old Hazel Potter, who had been known for her quick wit and animated storytelling, becomes withdrawn and reluctant to speak. 6-year-old Norval Davenport begins to develop actual stuttering behaviors as he struggles to meet Tudor's impossible standards for perfect speech. The children don't understand what's happening to them. They only know that an adult they trust has told them something is wrong with the way they talk, and they're desperately trying to fix it. They begin to avoid speaking whenever possible, developing elaborate strategies to hide their perceived speech problems. Some start pointing instead of speaking, others begin to whisper or mumble, and many simply stop talking altogether in group settings. What they discovered changed everything we thought we knew about the power of suggestion and the vulnerability of children to adult authority. The experiment had created the very condition it claimed to be investigating. Children who had never had speech problems suddenly exhibited all the signs of severe stuttering disorder, not because of any physical or neurological cause, but because they had been psychologically conditioned to fear their own voices. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn. Johnson and Tudor could see what was happening to the children, but instead of stopping the experiment, they continued for months, carefully documenting the psychological damage they were causing. They watched as previously confident children became anxious and withdrawn. They observed as normal speech patterns deteriorated into actual stuttering behaviors. They recorded the tears, the frustration, and the growing silence of children who had been taught to fear their own voices. The research sessions became exercises in psychological torture. Tudor would bring children into the therapy room and spend entire sessions focusing on their speech problems, pointing out every hesitation, every repetition, every natural disfluency. She would make them read aloud while constantly interrupting to correct their speech, creating an environment of constant criticism and anxiety. The children began to dread these sessions. They would try to hide when Tudor came to the orphanage, or they would claim to be sick to avoid the speech therapy appointments. Some developed physical symptoms of anxiety, including headaches, stomach aches, and difficulty sleeping. Others began to exhibit behavioral problems, acting out in ways that reflected their growing frustration and confusion. Meanwhile, the children in the positive treatment groups were thriving. Those who actually stuttered and received encouragement began to speak more freely and confidently. Normal speakers who received praise continued to communicate naturally and easily. The contrast was stark and should have been a clear indication that the treatment approach was causing the problems it claimed to study. But Johnson and Tudor continued their work. driven by what they saw as the greater good of scientific discovery. They believed that proving the diagnosogenic theory would help stuttering children everywhere, and they were willing to sacrifice the well-being of a few orphans to achieve that goal. This utilitarian calculus, the idea that the ends justify the means, would later become a central focus in discussions of research ethics. The experiment officially lasted 6 months, but its effects on the children would last for decades. And when the formal research period ended, Tudor simply stopped coming to the orphanage. There was no debriefing, no explanation to the children about what had happened to them, no follow-up care for those who had developed speech problems. The children were left to cope with the psychological damage on their own, with no understanding of why they had suddenly developed difficulties speaking. The institutional setting of the orphanage meant that there were no parents to notice the changes in the children's behavior or to advocate for their well-being. The staff, already overwhelmed with caring for hundreds of children, had no training in recognizing the signs of psychological trauma. The children who had been damaged by the experiment simply disappeared into the system, carrying their wounds in silence. What Johnson and Tudor had discovered was indeed groundbreaking, but not in the way they had hoped. They had proven that stuttering could be induced through psychological manipulation, but they had also demonstrated the profound power of authority figures to damage vulnerable children. Their research showed that the relationship between therapist and client could be used as a weapon, turning what should be a healing interaction into a source of trauma. The immediate aftermath of the experiment reveals the true character of those involved. Johnson, realizing the implications of what they had done, made a decision that would define his legacy. He told Tudor that they should never publish their results, because the methods were too unethical. He understood that the academic community would be horrified by their approach, and he was right to be concerned. But instead of taking steps to help the children they had harmed, Johnson and Tudor chose to protect themselves. They buried the research, hiding it away in file cabinets and hoping it would never see the light of day. They made no effort to contact the children or to provide them with the help they needed to recover from the psychological trauma they had inflicted. The experiment became known as the Monster Study, a name that Johnson himself used in private conversations with colleagues. He understood that what they had done was monstrous, but he also understood that his career and reputation would be destroyed if the details became public. So he kept the secret, and Tudor, bound by her relationship with her advisor, kept it too. For decades, the Monster Study remained a dark secret whispered about in academic circles. Speech pathologists and psychologists who learned about it were sworn to secrecy, and the story became a cautionary tale told in hushed tones at professional conferences. Everyone who heard about it understood that it represented a line that should never be crossed, but few were willing to speak publicly about what had happened. The children, meanwhile, grew up and left the orphanage, carrying the scars of their experience with them. Many continued to struggle with speech problems throughout their lives, never understanding why they had suddenly developed difficulties as children. Others dealt with anxiety, depression, and problems with self-confidence that could be traced back to those months in 1939, when they were told that something was fundamentally wrong with the way they communicated. The story might have remained hidden forever, if not for a chance encounter decades later. In 2001, a journalist named Jim Dyer was working on a story about the history of speech therapy when he stumbled upon a reference to this mysterious study. His curiosity piqued. He began to investigate, not knowing that he was about to uncover one of the most shocking cases of research abuse in American history. Dyer's investigation took him deep into the archives of the University of Iowa, where he found dusty files containing Tudor's thesis and Johnson's correspondence about the experiment. What he discovered was shocking even to someone who had covered controversial topics for years. The documents revealed not just the details of the experiment, but also the callous attitude of the researchers toward the children they had harmed. What Dyer uncovered was a paper trail that revealed the full extent of the cover-up. He found letters between Johnson and other researchers discussing the experiment, memos about the decision not to publish, and evidence that the university administration had known about the study for decades, but had done nothing to acknowledge the harm done or to help the victims. The documents revealed that Johnson had been proud of his work, at least initially. In letters to colleagues, he described the experiment as groundbreaking and revolutionary. He believed that he had discovered the key to understanding stuttering, and he was excited about the implications for treatment. It was only later, as he began to understand the ethical implications of his methods, that he became secretive about the research. Tudor's thesis, which had been approved by the university and filed in the library, contained detailed descriptions of the psychological damage inflicted on the children. She wrote about their tears, their fear, their growing reluctance to speak, but she presented these observations as scientific data rather than evidence of harm. Her clinical detachment from the suffering she had caused was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire document. Dyer's investigation also revealed that the university had made some effort to distance itself from the study over the years, but these efforts had been focused on protecting the institution's reputation rather than helping the victims. Officials had quietly removed references to the study from public documents and had discouraged faculty from discussing it, but they had never attempted to locate the children who had been harmed or to provide them with assistance. The revelation of the monster study sparked national outrage when Dyer's story was published. The public was horrified by the details of the experiment and by the decades-long cover-up that had followed. The story was picked up by major news outlets across the country, and suddenly the University of Iowa found itself at the center of a firestorm of criticism. The university's initial response was defensive and inadequate. Officials claimed that the research had been conducted according to the standards of the time and that it would be unfair to judge it by modern ethical standards. They argued that the knowledge gained from the study had contributed to advances in speech therapy and that the sacrifice of the few had benefited the many. But this response only intensified the public outrage. Critics pointed out that even by the standards of 1939, deliberately harming children was recognized as unethical. They noted that the researchers themselves had understood that their methods were problematic, which was why they had chosen to hide their results. The university's attempts to justify the experiment were seen as a continuation of the original cover-up. The story also caught the attention of lawyers who specialize in cases involving institutional abuse. They began to investigate whether any of the children from the experiment were still alive and whether they might have grounds for a lawsuit against the university. What they found was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Many of the children who had been subjected to the negative treatment had indeed carried speech problems and psychological difficulties throughout their lives. Some had struggled with stuttering for decades, never understanding why they had suddenly developed problems as children. Others had dealt with anxiety, depression, and problems with self-confidence that could be traced back to their experience in the experiment. The lawyers were able to locate 6 surviving subjects from the experiment, all of them now in their 70s and 80s. When they learned the truth about what had been done to them, their reactions ranged from shock to anger to a deep sense of betrayal. For the first time in their lives, they understood why they had suddenly developed speech problems as children and why they had carried those problems for so long. The legal case that followed was about more than just financial compensation. It was about recognition of the harm that had been done and accountability for the institutions that had allowed it to happen. The surviving subjects wanted the university to acknowledge what had been done to them and to take responsibility for the decades of suffering they had endured. The lawsuit revealed additional disturbing details about the experiment and its aftermath. It emerged that some university officials had known about the study for decades but had chosen to keep it secret to protect the institution's reputation. Internal documents showed that there had been discussions about the ethical problems with the research, but these concerns had been dismissed in favor of protecting the university's image. The case also revealed that the experiment had been more extensive than originally reported. There were indications that similar studies had been conducted with other groups of children, and that the abuse had been part of a broader pattern of using vulnerable populations for research purposes. The university had treated the orphans as expendable subjects whose welfare was less important than scientific progress. After years of legal proceedings, the university finally agreed to a settlement that included financial compensation for the survivors and a formal apology for the harm that had been done. The settlement was worth nearly $1 million. But for the survivors, the money was less important than the recognition of what had been done to them. The university's apology was carefully worded but significant. It acknowledged that the research had been unethical and harmful, and it accepted responsibility for the damage done to the children. It also committed to ensuring that such research would never happen again, and to supporting efforts to educate others about the importance of research ethics. But the most powerful part of this story isn't about the money or the legal proceedings. It's about what this experiment taught us about the fundamental principles of ethical research and the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation. The monster study became a cornerstone case in the development of modern research ethics, helping to establish the informed consent protocols and institutional review boards that protect research subjects today. The experiment violated every principle we now consider sacred in human research. There was no informed consent, no consideration of risk versus benefit, no protection for vulnerable populations, and no oversight of the research process. The children were treated as mere objects of study rather than as human beings deserving of dignity and protection. The legacy of the monster study extends far beyond the immediate victims. It serves as a constant reminder of what can happen when scientific ambition isn't tempered by ethical consideration. It shows us why we need rigorous ethical oversight, why informed consent is non-negotiable, and why vulnerable populations deserve extra protection. Today, every research institution has ethics committees that review proposed studies, ensuring that the rights and welfare of participants are protected. Every researcher must undergo ethics training, learning about cases like the monster study to understand why these protections exist. The experiment is taught in ethics courses around the world as an example of how research can go terribly wrong when proper safeguards aren't in place. The development of modern research ethics can be traced directly to cases like the monster study. The Nuremberg Code, developed in response to Nazi medical experiments, established the principle of informed consent. The Declaration of Helsinki further refined these principles, and the Belmont Report, published in 1979, established the three fundamental principles of research ethics: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. These principles were developed specifically to prevent experiments like the monster study from ever happening again. Respect for persons requires that research subjects be treated as autonomous agents capable of making their own decisions about participation. Beneficence requires that researchers minimize harm and maximize benefits. Justice requires that the benefits and burdens of research be distributed fairly, with special protection for vulnerable populations. The monster study violated all three of these principles. The children were not treated as autonomous agents, but as objects to be manipulated. The researchers maximized harm rather than minimizing it, and they targeted a vulnerable population that could not protect itself. The experiment stands as a perfect example of how research can go wrong when these fundamental principles are ignored. The children who suffered through this experiment deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as the reason we now have stronger protections for all research participants. Their suffering led to changes that have protected countless others from similar harm. Every time a researcher must obtain informed consent, every time an ethics committee rejects a potentially harmful study, every time vulnerable populations receive special protections, we see the lasting impact of their sacrifice. The monster study also teaches us about the importance of speaking up when we see unethical behavior. E. Johnson and Tudor were not working in isolation. They were part of a broader academic community that included professors, administrators, and other researchers. Many of these people knew about the experiment, either while it was happening or shortly afterward, but they chose to remain silent. This silence was not just about protecting individual reputations, it was about protecting the reputation of the entire field of speech pathology and psychology. People were afraid that speaking out would damage the credibility of their profession and set back important research. But their silence allowed the harm to continue and prevented the development of better ethical standards. The story reminds us that we all have a responsibility to speak up when we see research that violates ethical principles. We cannot rely on institutional protections alone. We must also be willing to challenge unethical behavior when we encounter it. The monster study shows us what happens when good people choose to remain silent in the face of obvious wrongdoing. This story also highlights the particular vulnerability of children in research settings. Children cannot give meaningful consent to participate in research, and they are particularly susceptible to the influence of adult authority figures. The monster study shows us why we need special protections for children, and why research involving minors requires extra scrutiny and oversight. The experiment also demonstrates the danger of using vulnerable populations as research subjects. The orphans were chosen specifically because they had no parents to advocate for them and no one to ask questions about their treatment. This made them ideal subjects from a research perspective, but it also made them particularly vulnerable to abuse. Today, we recognize that vulnerable populations require extra protections in research settings. This includes not only children but also prisoners, people with mental illness, pregnant women, and others who may not be able to protect their own interests. The monster study shows us why these protections are necessary and what can happen when they are absent. As we conclude this difficult but important story, we're left with crucial questions about the balance between scientific progress and human dignity. The monster study shows us that some knowledge simply isn't worth the cost of obtaining it, and that the protection of vulnerable people must always be our highest priority. The experiment also raises questions about how we remember and learn from past mistakes. For decades, the monster study was hidden from public view, which prevented the broader community from learning from it. It was only when the story finally came to light that we could begin to understand its full implications and use it to improve our ethical standards. The orphan children of the Iowa Soldiers' Home couldn't advocate for themselves in 1939, but their story continues to advocate for ethical research practices today. Their suffering was not meaningless. It led to fundamental changes in how we conduct research and protect vulnerable populations. Every researcher who undergoes ethics training, every institutional review board that rejects a potentially harmful study, every informed consent form that protects a research subject, stands as a testament to their sacrifice. This is why we study history's darkest chapters, not to dwell on past mistakes, but to ensure they never happen again. The monster study reminds us that the price of scientific progress should never be paid by those who cannot defend themselves. It shows us that ethical research is not just about following rules and regulations, it's about recognizing the fundamental humanity of every person who participates in our studies. The legacy of the monster study is complex and painful, but it is also ultimately hopeful. It shows us that even the darkest chapters in our history can lead to positive change if we are willing to confront them honestly and learn from them. The children who suffered in 1939 could not have imagined that their pain would eventually lead to protections for millions of other research subjects, but that is exactly what happened. Their story reminds us that we have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves, to speak up when we see wrongdoing, and to ensure that the pursuit of knowledge never comes at the expense of human dignity. The monster study may have been one of psychology's darkest hours, but it also helped to usher in a new era of ethical research that continues to protect vulnerable people today.